February 20th, 1942. The skies above Rabaul shimmer with the oppressive heat of a South Pacific morning. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare banks his F-4F Wildcat hard to the left, his eyes locked on a sight that makes his stomach drop through the floor of his cockpit. 9 Japanese G-4M Betty bombers are closing on the carrier USS Lexington in tight formation, and the only thing standing between them and 2,000 American sailors is O'Hare and his wingman, except his wingman's guns have jammed. The mechanisms failed at the worst possible moment. He's alone. The throttle is already firewall forward, the engine screaming at maximum power. His ammunition is limited to what sits in his wing-mounted guns, and somewhere above those bombers, unseen in the blinding glare of the tropical sun, Japanese Zero escorts are circling like sharks waiting for the scent of blood. What O'Hare doesn't know, what nobody in the American Navy fully understands yet, is that the tactics drilled into him back in training are already obsolete. The rulebook says, engage, turn, pursue, outfight your enemy in the classic dogfighting tradition that worked so brilliantly in the last war. But the Zero has rewritten those rules in the blood of pilots who trusted the old wisdom, and any pilot who tries to play by the old ones is flying toward his own funeral. The tragedy unfolding across the Pacific in early 1942 isn't just about aircraft or industrial capacity or strategic positioning. It's about confidence. American pilots grew up on stories of Eddie Rickenbacker, of swirling dogfights over the trenches, where the better stick and rudder man wins through superior skill and raw guts. They trained in aircraft designed for exactly that kind of combat. They practiced maneuvers meant to outturn and outfight opponents in close-range engagements. And then they met an enemy that turned those cherished beliefs into a death sentence. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, the kill ratios are horrifying. For every Zero shot down, American fighters are losing aircraft at rates that squadron commanders can barely bring themselves to report accurately. The Japanese pilots aren't just winning these engagements, they're dominating them with an ease that borders on contemptuous. And the worst part, the detail that keeps American commanders awake at night, many of the Japanese pilots aren't even trying particularly hard. They're playing with their food. The Mitsubishi A6M0 is, in the winter of 1942, quite possibly the most dangerous fighter aircraft in the world. It can turn tighter than anything the Americans, British, or Dutch can put in the sky against it. Its climb rate borders on supernatural, allowing it to gain altitude advantages that seem to defy the physics of powered flight. Japanese pilots speak of the Zero like a living thing, an extension of their own bodies that responds to the slightest input with a grace and precision that Western aircraft simply cannot match. Reports filtering back to Washington from the scattered remnants of Pacific squadrons describe Zeros making turns so impossibly tight that American pilots following them black out from the G-forces before they can line up a shot. The Zero seems to violate the laws of physics themselves, and for pilots trained their entire careers to win through superior maneuvering, this creates an equation with no solution. Consider the brutal mathematics of the problem facing American aviators. A typical American fighter of this era can sustain a turn radius of roughly 1/200 feet at combat speed without losing excessive energy. The Zero, in the hands of a skilled pilot pushing its capabilities, can turn inside 900 feet. That difference, just 300 feet of radius, sounds almost trivial on paper. In the air, it means death. Every turn, the Zero gains angle on its opponent. Every completed circle, it creeps inexorably closer to a firing solution. An American pilot who commits to a turning fight against a Zero has roughly 90 seconds before that geometry becomes unsurvivable. The Japanese pilots know this mathematics intimately. They've been trained since their first days in flight school to exploit it, and they do, with devastating efficiency that leaves American squadrons decimated. But here's what makes the Zero's dominance so psychologically crushing for its opponents. It isn't just mechanical advantage, it's the confidence gap between the two pilot corps. Japanese naval aviators in 1942 represent the most experienced carrier pilot corps in the entire world. Many have been flying combat missions since the China campaign years earlier. They've accumulated thousands of hours in their aircraft under actual combat conditions. When they engage American pilots, many fresh from abbreviated wartime training programs, some with fewer than 200 hours total in their cockpits, the skill differential is enormous and immediately apparent. If you're finding this breakdown of aerial combat tactics fascinating, take a second to subscribe to the channel. We dive deep into the tactics that changed history, and there's much more to come. The first pilots to survive extended engagements with Zeros bring back reports that read like horror stories from another dimension. They describe aircraft that can reverse direction in the time it takes to blink. Enemies who seem to anticipate every move before it happens, as if reading their opponent's minds. Tracers streaming past canopies in endless patterns that feel personal and malevolent. The psychological impact on survivors is severe and lasting. Pilots who survive their first Zero encounter often describe a complete collapse of everything they thought they knew about air combat. The confidence built through months of rigorous training evaporates in 30 seconds of desperate maneuvering against an opponent who seems to exist in a different category entirely. But survival, even terrified and traumatic survival, produces data. And in those first chaotic weeks of the war, a handful of pilots begin noticing something strange about their encounters. The Zero has a secret. Actually, it has several secrets, and one of them is so significant that understanding it will eventually break the entire Japanese fighter strategy wide open. The Zero achieves its impossible maneuverability through a bargain with the devil that Japanese designers made deliberately. To make the aircraft light enough to turn like that, they stripped away almost everything that makes a fighter survivable in combat. Armor protection for the pilot? Gone entirely. Self-sealing fuel tanks that prevent catastrophic fires? None installed. Structural reinforcement that lets an aircraft survive battle damage? Reduced to the absolute minimum. The Zero weighs roughly 5,500 pounds, fully loaded for combat. An F4F Wildcat tips the scales at nearly 8,000 pounds in the same configuration. That massive weight difference buys the Zero its legendary agility. It also means that a solid burst of 50 caliber fire will do absolutely catastrophic damage. The Zero doesn't just get hit and keep flying. It comes apart, it burns, it kills its pilot. But there's another secret, and this one takes longer to discover because it only becomes apparent in specific flight conditions. The Zero's control surfaces, the ailerons that roll the aircraft from side to side, become increasingly ineffective at high speed. Below 275 miles per hour, the Zero is a dancer, responding to the lightest touch with instant obedience. Above 350 miles per hour, it transforms into something else entirely. The controls stiffen dramatically. The responsiveness that makes it so deadly in a turning fight vanishes almost completely. The aircraft that can outturn anything at moderate speeds becomes sluggish and predictable when pushed into the higher speed ranges that diving attacks produce. Japanese designers knew about this limitation when they finalized the Zero's specifications. They considered it acceptable because their entire combat doctrine emphasized the turning fight at moderate speeds. No rational enemy would be crazy enough to refuse that engagement when facing a clearly superior opponent. Why prepare for a tactical situation that would never actually happen in combat? The man who first systematically exploits this weakness is a lieutenant commander named John Smith Thatch. Jimmy Thatch is not a typical Navy aviator of his generation. He's an analytical thinker in a community that prizes instinct and aggression over careful analysis. While other pilots swap stories about close calls and lucky shots over drinks, Thatch spends his evenings with pencil and paper, working through the geometry of air combat like a mathematician approaching a particularly interesting equation. When reports of the Zero's seemingly supernatural capabilities begin reaching Pearl Harbor, Thatch doesn't panic like many of his colleagues. He gets curious instead. There has to be a weakness somewhere. Physics demands it. No aircraft can possibly be superior in every regime of flight. Thatch's first contribution to solving the Zero problem is the famous beam defense position that will eventually bear his name forever, the Thatch Weave. But his deeper insight, the one that really matters, is more fundamental than any single maneuver. It's about discipline. It's about teaching pilots to suppress every instinct drilled into them through months of training and do exactly the opposite of what feels natural in the moment. The Zero wants you to turn. The Zero pilot has spent years perfecting the art of the turning engagement. His entire combat philosophy depends on you accepting that invitation to fight on his terms. So don't accept it. Refuse the dance entirely. That's when everything begins to change. The one-turn maneuver isn't really a single technique that can be practiced and perfected. It's a philosophy expressed through brutal, unwavering discipline. Engage at high speed from above whenever possible. Make one slashing pass through the enemy formation. Fire your guns, then dive away at maximum speed before the Zero can respond effectively. Never, under any circumstances, pull into a sustained turn to follow a target that's evading. 1 turn to engage, 1 turn to disengage. No exceptions whatsoever. If you miss your shot, you climb back to altitude and set up another pass from scratch. You sacrifice immediate opportunities for the safety of consistent methodology. You trade natural aggression for calculated survival, and slowly, painfully, you chip away at an enemy who has no effective answer for an opponent who simply refuses to play by his carefully optimized rules. The resistance to this new doctrine among American pilots is fierce, and sometimes bitter. Pilots hate it viscerally. It feels like cowardice dressed up in tactical language. Everything in their training, their warrior culture, their very identity as fighter pilots screams that real men turn and fight regardless of the odds. Running away from an engagement isn't combat, it's retreat. It's shameful. Squadron commanders have to enforce the new tactics through explicit threat of discipline. Veterans who've survived their first encounters by luck rather than method resist change most strongly. They've made the old way work through sheer skill and fortune. Why abandon approaches that kept them alive? The consequences of breaking discipline are immediate and absolutely fatal. Records from the Guadalcanal campaign tell the story in statistics that cannot be argued with. Pilots who follow the one-turn doctrine survive their missions and return to fight again. Pilots who chase, who commit to turning engagements, who let ego override training for even a moment, they simply don't come back. Their aircraft are found crashed in the jungle, or they vanish without a trace over open water. But here's where the story takes its most fascinating psychological turn. If you're enjoying this deep dive into tactical evolution, hit that like button. It genuinely helps us bring you more content like this. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots is profound and remains largely invisible to American intelligence until much later in the war. Imagine for a moment being Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, with dozens of confirmed kills against Chinese, Dutch, British, and American aircraft stretching back years. Your entire combat methodology depends on one fundamental assumption that you've never had reason to question. The enemy will turn with you and try to outfight you. Your feints, your trap maneuvers, your carefully practiced combination attacks, all of them require an opponent who engages on your terms. That's how air combat works. That's how it has always worked. And suddenly, inexplicably, the Americans won't cooperate anymore. They aren't fighting the way enemies are supposed to fight. They're slashing through formations, firing wildly, and running away at high speed before you can demonstrate your clearly superior skill. You can't prove you're better than them if they refuse to stay and compete. You can't show dominance over an opponent who won't acknowledge the contest. That's when something insidious begins to erode at the foundations. Confidence. Combat confidence is a surprisingly fragile psychological construct. It's built on thousands of small validations accumulated over time, successful engagements where skill produced predictable results, moments where training proved its value, victories that confirmed your mental model of how combat works. The Japanese aces of 1942 have spent years building an internal model of how air combat unfolds. The zero is the perfect physical expression of that model. And when the model stops working reliably, when enemies refuse to behave the way the model predicts, the confidence it supported begins to crack. Not all at once, not in obvious ways, but steadily, engagement after engagement, as American pilots stubbornly refuse to play the game they're supposed to play. The dates and locations matter in understanding this shift. In June 1942, at Midway, Japanese naval aviation suffers a catastrophic material blow that changes the war's trajectory. 4 fleet carriers sink beneath Pacific waves, but the pilot losses, while significant, are actually survivable for the Japanese Naval Air Arm. The real damage happens over the grinding months that follow. Guadalcanal becomes a meat grinder that devours pilots and aircraft alike. The Tokyo Express runs nightly reinforcement missions that require constant air cover. Japanese pilots fly endless, exhausting missions defending supply convoys, attacking Henderson Field, escorting vulnerable bombers through hostile skies. And with each mission, they encounter American pilots who have learned the hard lesson and internalized it completely. 1 turn, dive away at maximum speed, climb back to altitude, reset the engagement from scratch, repeat until the enemy is destroyed or withdraws. Japanese aces who have never questioned their own abilities begin experiencing something deeply unfamiliar. Genuine doubt about outcomes. They're still scoring kills against Americans. American pilots still make mistakes, still break discipline in the heat of combat, still give them opportunities to demonstrate superior skill. But the hit rate is declining measurably. The easy victories against panicked opponents who obligingly turn into perfectly set up gun sites are becoming frustratingly rare. Replacing them are unsatisfying encounters against enemies who appear briefly, fire an inaccurate burst, and vanish into a screaming dive that the Zero simply cannot follow without losing the control authority that makes it deadly. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In the first 3 months of the Pacific War, the kill ratio heavily favors Japan in virtually every engagement. Estimates vary among historians, but some analyses suggest Japanese pilots were achieving exchange rates of 6 to 1 or even better in certain battles. By late 1942, that ratio has shifted dramatically in ways Japanese commanders cannot ignore. American pilot loss rates are dropping month over month. Japanese loss rates are climbing steadily. The Zero aircraft hasn't changed at all. The airframe is mechanically identical to what flew over Pearl Harbor. What's changed is that the Zero's single greatest advantage, the ability to outturn any opponent in a close-range engagement, has been systematically neutralized by pilots who simply refuse to engage on those terms anymore. Consider what this psychological shift means for an individual Japanese ace. Tetsuo Iwamoto, credited with over 80 aerial victories during the course of the entire war, later described the Guadalcanal period as the beginning of the end for Japanese air superiority in the Pacific. Not because of any revolutionary new American aircraft arriving in theater, the Wildcat is still clearly outclassed on paper by the Zero, but because American pilots stopped dying on schedule the way they were supposed to. Every engagement that didn't produce a kill for the Japanese meant fuel consumed that couldn't be replaced easily, ammunition expended that had to be shipped across vulnerable supply lines, precious airframe hours accumulated on aircraft with limited service lives. Japan's pilot replacement pipeline is dangerously thin compared to American capacity. Training programs are shortened as combat losses mount, and experienced instructors are pulled back to operational squadrons. New pilots arrive at the front with fewer flight hours than their predecessors had when they merely entered advanced training phases. The institutional knowledge base is eroding even as the tactical challenges grow more severe. But the veterans feel the shift most acutely in their daily experience. A pilot who has survived 100 successful engagements knows exactly how combat encounters should unfold. The geometry is etched into his nervous system through repetition. When the enemy aircraft turns to engage, you turn tighter inside his radius. You watch the distance close with each revolution. You feel the familiar vibration through the stick as you approach optimal firing parameters. The kill is inevitable, predictable, earned through superior skill and a superior aircraft designed for exactly this moment. Now that comfortable sequence keeps breaking down unexpectedly. The enemy doesn't turn to fight. He dives away at full power instead. You follow because that's what fighters do, but the controls feel mushy and unresponsive at high speed. The stick requires uncomfortable force to move. By the time you've pulled out of the dive to preserve your maneuvering advantage, the American is already climbing back to altitude for another irritating pass. You're burning fuel chasing an opponent who won't let you catch him on your terms. The tactical mathematics are brutal and inescapable. A Zero pilot who chases an American diving away enters exactly the speed regime where his aircraft's carefully hidden weaknesses become painfully apparent. Above 350 miles per hour, the Zero's controls require significant physical force to move effectively. Roll rate drops precipitously. The American, flying a heavier aircraft actually designed for high-speed performance, is gaining tactical advantage with every second the dive continues. If the Zero pilot persists in the chase, he risks overshooting his target entirely when it finally does maneuver. If he pulls out to preserve his low-speed maneuvering advantage, the American simply climbs away, and the entire engagement resets to neutral. There's no good option available. The geometry favors the pilot who established the engagement terms. That's when Japanese pilots begin to understand something terrible and fundamental. The game has changed completely, and they don't know how to change with it. American tactical innovation doesn't stop with the basic one-turn concept. The Thatch Weave, two fighters flying roughly parallel paths and turning sharply into each other when attacked from behind, forcing any pursuing enemy to fly directly through the wingman's gun sights, adds a defensive layer that further negates the Zero's advantages. Japanese pilots attempting to pick off an isolated Wildcat find themselves suddenly facing not the aircraft they're chasing, but its partner, already aligned for a devastating deflection shot. The technique is simple, almost mechanical in its execution. That's precisely its genius. It doesn't require superior individual skill. It just requires discipline and trust between wingmen. Discipline and systematic training are things the American military can produce at industrial scale. Training programs are standardized across all facilities. Tactics are documented in detail, shared between units, drilled repeatedly until they become automatic responses requiring no conscious thought. A pilot, fresh from training in Florida, might have only 300 hours in his logbook, but he knows the thatch weave cold. He knows the one-turn doctrine. He knows in his bones that turning with a zero is suicide regardless of how skilled he thinks he is. Japanese pilots, by contrast, rely heavily on individual expertise built painstakingly over years of experience. Their system produces genuine masters of aerial combat. It cannot mass-produce baseline competence the way American training does. And in a war of attrition stretching across years, reliable competence at massive scale defeats scattered mastery in limited quantities every single time. The summer of 1943 brings powerful new American aircraft to the Pacific Theater. The F-6F Hellcat arrives in squadron strength, built from the ground up specifically to fight the Zero on American tactical terms. It's heavier and more rugged than the Wildcat. It's faster in level flight and much faster in a dive. It's better armored to protect its pilot. Its dive performance is excellent by any standard. Its controls remain crisp and effective at high speeds, where the Zero becomes sluggish. The Hellcat pilots don't need to be as rigidly disciplined about refusing turning engagements. They're flying an aircraft that can actually survive one if circumstances require it. But the tactical habits instilled through the brutal Darwinian education of 1942 persist regardless. American pilots continue fighting with energy tactics, speed, altitude advantage, diving attacks, vertical maneuvering. They've internalized the fundamental lesson completely. The Zero's theoretical advantages don't matter if you never let them come into play during actual combat. Japanese pilots now face an escalating nightmare scenario with no apparent solution. The enemy fields better aircraft, enjoys superior numbers, employs effective tactics, and commands industrial capacity that defies rational comprehension. By late 1943, American carrier task forces are routinely deploying more fighters than the entire Japanese naval air arm can field from all sources combined. The production differential is obscene and growing worse. For every Zero lost in combat, Japan might manage to replace it with one more after significant delay. For every Hellcat lost, America replaces it with dozens almost immediately. But the psychological dimension cuts deepest for the Japanese pilots. Veterans who survived the heady early victories find themselves facing opponents who no longer fear them or their legendary aircraft. The American pilots of 1943 aren't the panicked, inexperienced novices of 1941 and early 1942. They're survivors of an intense Darwinian selection process. The pilots who turned with Zeros died and were removed from the equation. The pilots who learned discipline and survived gained experience, developed genuine skill, and became dangerous opponents in their own right. When a Japanese ace engages a Hellcat in late 1943, he's often facing an American pilot with as many combat hours as himself. The skill gap has largely closed, the equipment gap has reversed direction, and the tactical gap, the fundamental advantage the Zero's superior agility once provided, no longer exists in practice because the Americans simply will not allow it to matter. The one-turn maneuver and its underlying philosophy are never taught in Japanese pilot training programs. They can't be because the entire Japanese combat philosophy depends fundamentally on close maneuvering combat at moderate speeds. Their aircraft are designed specifically for it. Their pilots are carefully selected for the reflexes and aggressive temperament it requires. To abandon that doctrine wholesale would be to admit that everything they've built over decades was conceptually wrong from the beginning, so they don't adapt to the new reality. They can't bring themselves to do it. Records and post-war interviews suggest that Japanese pilot morale reached its absolute lowest point in the period between late 1943 and mid-1944. Operational diaries recovered from units defending the shrinking island perimeter speak of exhausted air crews, declining individual performance, and a pervasive sense that the tide had permanently and irreversibly turned against them. The aces who remained operational, and there were still some, still genuinely deadly in the right circumstances, fought with a fatalism that bordered on despair. Their finely honed skills still worked occasionally. The Zero could still kill an undisciplined or simply unlucky American who made a critical mistake. But the systematic dominance that characterized the early months of the war was gone forever. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, what American pilots immediately dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, serves as the final devastating confirmation of everything that had changed. Japanese naval aviation launches its last great carrier offensive against the American fleet. Over 400 aircraft attack across 2 days of intense combat. American fighters, vectored by radar to intercept at tactically optimal positions, armed with superior aircraft and thoroughly trained in tactics that systematically nullify Japanese advantages, inflict absolutely catastrophic losses. Reports indicate Japanese aviation loses more than 300 aircraft in the battle and its immediate aftermath. American losses are a small fraction of that devastating number. The exchange ratios of 1942 have not merely reversed, they've inverted to a degree that would have seemed impossible just 30 months earlier when Japanese naval aviation seemed invincible. The confidence that animated Japanese naval aviation from Pearl Harbor through Midway dies in those 2 terrible days. Not the courage. That never wavers. Japanese pilots continue flying with extraordinary personal bravery throughout the remainder of the war. Kamikaze tactics, introduced in the Philippines that autumn, demonstrate a willingness to sacrifice that goes beyond anything Western observers can fully comprehend. But confidence, the fundamental belief that superior skill and fighting spirit will produce victory against any odds, is gone forever. It broke somewhere over the slot in the grinding skies above Guadalcanal, when American pilots stopped turning to fight and Japanese aces discovered that their lifetime mastery of aerial combat no longer mattered. That's what makes this story more than just tactical history from a war 8 decades past. It's about the psychology of dominance and how it can be shattered completely through asymmetric thinking. The Zero was designed to win a certain kind of fight. Japanese pilots were trained their entire careers to fight exactly that way. When their opponents simply refused to oblige, the entire carefully constructed system failed catastrophically. Not because the Zero became a bad aircraft overnight, not because Japanese pilots suddenly lost their hard-won skills, but because the engagement envelope shifted permanently to a place where those advantages couldn't apply. The lesson resonates far beyond aviation history. Dominant systems in any competitive domain contain embedded assumptions about how competition will occur. Those assumptions become critical vulnerabilities. An opponent who can't win on established terms faces 2 stark options: accept defeat gracefully or change the terms entirely. The American Navy's tactical innovators, Thack, O'Hare, the countless anonymous combat veterans who figured out what worked through desperate trial and error, chose the second option. They couldn't outturn the Zero no matter how hard they tried, so they made turning irrelevant to outcomes. For the Japanese aces, the men who had mastered their difficult craft over years of dedicated training and actual combat, this was the cruelest possible form of defeat. Their skills weren't obsolete exactly, they were simply inapplicable to the new reality. The Americans never gave them a fair fight where those skills could matter, never stood still long enough to be outmaneuvered the way doctrine predicted, never accepted the invitation to dance on Japanese terms. And every slashing pass, every diving attack, every frustrating engagement that ended with American aircraft climbing away to reset, each one whispered the same terrible message: your excellence doesn't matter here anymore. Combat in any domain ultimately comes down to who can impose their preferred style of engagement on the fight. The Zero was a masterpiece of aircraft design built specifically for one particular style of fighting. American tactical evolution rendered that style suicidal for Americans who attempted it, so they simply stopped using it. The Japanese, bound by doctrine and aircraft design and deep cultural commitment to a certain vision of honorable combat, couldn't respond effectively. By the time they fully understood what was happening and why, the irreplaceable pilot corps that might have adapted was already bleeding out over the jungle islands of the South Pacific. The pilots who came after rushed through drastically abbreviated training programs, thrown into cockpits with a tiny fraction of the experience their predecessors had, inherited an impossible tactical situation. They faced enemies flying better aircraft, using superior tactics, backed by seemingly inexhaustible resources. The confidence that defined Japanese naval aviation in December 1941 was gone completely, replaced by a grim determination that bordered on nihilism. They kept fighting because that was their duty. The Japanese pilots' personal courage was never for a moment in question, but they fought without the sustaining belief that individual excellence could meaningfully alter outcomes. And without that belief, the spirit that made them so extraordinarily dangerous in the early months had evaporated beyond recovery. So the next time you study an account of Pacific air combat, pay close attention to the moments that seem anticlimactic or inconclusive. The engagements where American pilots fired a burst, missed their target, and dove away rather than pursuing a potential kill. The encounters that ended without clear resolution, because neither side would accept the other's preferred terms. Those apparent non-events are actually the real story. Those stubborn refusals to engage on disadvantageous terms are precisely what broke an empire's air superiority. The Zero ended the war as a poignant symbol of everything Japan had lost. A beautiful aircraft, perfectly designed for a war that nobody wanted to fight anymore. And somewhere in that cruel irony is a truth about strategy that transcends any single conflict. The opponent who understands your system better than you understand it yourself doesn't actually need to beat it directly. He just needs to step outside it entirely. One turn, then gone. What conflict do you think was most shaped by one side refusing to fight on the enemy's terms? Tell us in the comments.